Everybody, this is Dream, and today we have a 7-game slate for the NBA. It's a pretty good slate for basketball. Not a ton of injuries today, surprisingly. I mean, there are a few though, but we have some decent options around across the board and all price ranges. And I think it's a really good slate, actually. For DraftKings, at least, seems really good. Now, FanDuel is kind of strange today because there's not as much value plays. But the more expensive guys tend to be a little bit cheaper than they are on DraftKings, so that's an interesting thing. I think both places are playable today, and so let's get into that injury report first. We're going to start off with the Pistons. Hayes is questionable. Cunningham, Stewart, and Bagley are out. For the Celtics, Smart and Brogdon are out, and Robert Williams is questionable. For the Magic, Okeke is out. For the Hawks, Okongwu is questionable. For the Bulls, Javante Green is out, and Dragic is questionable. For the Timberwolves, Gobert and Prince are questionable. Towns is out, and McLaughlin is out. For the Rockets, Porter Jr. is out, and Jabari Smith is questionable. For the Hornets, Ball is questionable, and Oubre Jr. is out. For the Jazz, Olenek is out. For the Spurs, Vassell is out. And for the Trailblazers, Winslow is out. It might be one of the smallest injury slates in a while for a 7-game slate. So here's my picks for each game so far. So we have Boston over Orlando, Milwaukee over Detroit, Chicago over Atlanta, Houston over Minnesota, Charlotte over Utah, the Spurs over the Trailblazers, and the Sacramento Kings over Memphis. So with that said, guys, let's get into the players I do like today. We're going to start with guards here and look at Peyton Pritchard for Boston. He should be good to go here and get a full complement of minutes with the injuries to Smart and Brogdon. I expect him to play well in this game and play a lot more minutes than he normally does, which gives him some opportunity. And he's also basically minimum priced here on DraftKings, so he's viable. Then we'll look at Mike Conley. Mike Conley has been pretty good lately. The last 4 games, he's been over 30 fantasy points. I look for that to continue here against Charlotte, who really doesn't have much to stop him. Then we'll look at Colin Sexton, another guy for Utah that just seems a little bit too cheap today. He's been playing pretty well lately, and he has some nice upside on this particular slate. His floor is pretty good too, so you don't have to worry too much about him screwing your lineup up way too much. Then we'll look at Desmond Bane, he was one of the only guys that played extremely good yesterday for the Grizzlies, at least for the first 3 quarters of the game. And then he's been really solid lately. His price point is still pretty good. He's really upped his game, and he's shooting the ball pretty well. And he's getting lots of rebounds and assists too, which is nice. So I think he's a viable option on this slate against Sacramento. But I do worry a little bit about Memphis, being on a back-to-back. But still, I think he's one of the few guys that are pretty much matchup-proof in this situation. Kevin Huerter also playing extremely well lately. He's had some really good games. His price has come down a little bit, which is also nice from his near 6,000. He is viable on the slate. He's been playing over 30 minutes a game most of these games, so I think he's viable. Then we'll look at Damian Lillard, who has a nice matchup here against the Spurs. He's been absolutely phenomenal lately, and I look for him to continue to do that. He had a really good game yesterday. Despite not shooting the ball pretty well, he still got a double-double and scored 49 fantasy points. I think he'll be able to get back on track today against the Spurs, who have not much defense there. So then we're going to look at Keegan Murray for Sacramento. Now he's been playing a lot of minutes lately, and he's getting more consistent as the season's progressed. His price point, I kind of expected it to pop up today, but it didn't, so I look for him to be a viable option on the slate in what should be a higher scoring game. Then we'll look at KJ Martin. Now, I don't love his price. It's a little bit higher than I'd like it to be, but he's been playing really well since he started starting. I don't think he's a must-play because of the situation, because of his price coming up, but overall, he is a viable option on the slate. He's playing a good amount of minutes, and he's got a nice plus matchup. Jeremy Sochan has been playing really well with the injuries there to the Spurs. I look for him to continue to do that, playing around 30 minutes a game. He has a little bit of a lower floor than I typically like, but he does have a good ceiling here, and he's been playing solid, so I think he's viable on the slate. DeMar DeRozan is probably one of my favorite higher priced options today. He has been a little bit streaky lately, but he's got a nice matchup here against Atlanta, and he should be the guy that the Bulls rely on in this game. a little bit more simply because of the position he plays and who will guard him. Then we'll look at Jason Tatum for the Boston Celtics. Now they have some guys out, and he's going to be taking even more usage than he normally does. He's been shooting really well and playing extremely well as well. He's been hitting lots of threes, getting to the free throw line a bunch, and that's just promoting him to have massive games. Now, I don't love his price point because he's come up a lot, but he's still viable on the slate. And then Jalen Duren, he seems like my favorite center today. He has played really well as a starter for Detroit, and he should be back in that role today with the injuries to other guys. And so I expect him to come out and play well and be a good force for fantasy points. He has got some nice upside, though his floor is pretty low, but he's played really well when starting, and so I expect him to continue that today, even though it is a little bit of a tough matchup. Then we'll look at Walker Kessler. Now, he kind of boogied us in the last game against Brooklyn, but he should be good to go in this one. His price has stayed up high, though, so do keep that in mind. But he has been really good starting, and I think that was one exception to the game. He should get over 30 minutes in this one, especially against Plumlee, so I think he's going to have a good game in this situation. With that said, let's go ahead and get over to FanDuel and get into our top plays here. Now, we're going to start with our guards. We're going to start with Mike Conley, who's a little bit more expensive here than he is on DraftKings, but he's still viable at the price point that he's at. I think is a good slate, a good option today, and he should be good to go in this matchup. He's got some nice upside in this plus matchup. Then we'll look at De'Aaron Fox, who's a little bit cheaper here on FanDuel than DraftKings. He's had some really big games lately. He's had a couple off games, but overall, he's got a nice matchup here against Memphis, who just played yesterday as well. I expect this to be a high-scoring game and them to go back and forth. Then we'll look at D'Angelo Russell from Minnesota. He has some nice upside in this situation, especially if more guys get ruled out from Minnesota, which could happen. And so, obviously, we're going to take a look and see, but he's a viable option on the slate. DeMar DeRozan looks like he's just way too cheap here on FanDuel. He's been extremely good in the games he's played recently. Obviously, he's had a few games off due to injury, so he should be good to go here, and he should be a high-flying scoring guy on this slate. Too cheap in my opinion, on this particular website. Then we'll look at Jaylen Brown. He has been really good in the last game, and I expect him to get over 40 minutes in this one as well with the injuries. His usage should go up, and him and Tatum both have really good upside in this matchup. Then we'll look at Peyton Pritchard. Now, he's not as cheap over here on DraftKings as he is on FanDuel, but he still has upside. He should get plenty of minutes in this one, and with several injuries to guards, he should be viable on the slate. Anthony Edwards also looks really interesting for Minnesota today. He has some nice upside, though his floor is a little bit lower than I'd like it to be, especially if guys end up coming back. But overall, it's a good matchup, and especially if guys get ruled out, he'd become a must-play. KJ Martin Jr. For Houston, also very interesting today. A little bit more expensive than I like him to be, but he's been really solid as a starter, and so I think he's viable on the slate. Al Horford looks really interesting here on FanDuel, simply because if Robert Williams ends up getting missing, he's going to probably end up playing over 30 or so minutes, and when he does that, he tends to play extremely well and have good upside. His usage should also be up in this matchup against Orlando. And then Jalen Duren. Now, he's not as ideal here on FanDuel as he is on DraftKings due to his price, but he still has some nice upside at this price point, and he should be good to go in this one. And then Nikola Vucevic, he's a little bit cheaper than I expected him to be here on FanDuel. He's got a good floor for this game, and so I think he's viable on the slate if you want to go off of Duren instead. He'd be a great option. There's plenty of value on both sites, I think, so I think will be a good slate. Overall, thank you guys for liking, commenting, subscribing. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below. And have a nice day, guys.